Alright, welcome to this week's GMBN Tech Show. Coming up on the show this week we have that new Trek Session downhill bike, the one with the high pivot and the idler wheel. We also talk a little bit about bikes with high pivots and idler wheels, funnily enough. There's also two pairs of shoes, one from Physique, another from Ride Concepts, who seem to be churning out shoes at some rate at the moment. And we also have a little look back at where Ibis bikes came from, seeing as the fact they've just celebrated being 40 years old. Cool stuff. Okay, welcome to the show. Let's talk about high pivot bikes, because undoubtedly you would have seen them starting to crop up more and more in recent times. Now, in particular, you will have seen the bikes from Forbidden. They've got the Druid, of course, and they've got the Dreadnought out there. They're trail bikes with a high pivot to essentially help the bike perform a bit more like a low pivot, but having the suspension action of a high pivot, which we're going to get to in a minute. You might have also seen that Norco Shore, which is a kind of free ride bike park bike, I guess you could call it that. You could run it with a single crown Zeb, or you could run it with a pair of boxes on there or something like that and just smash the hell out of the mountainside. But probably the best example of what a high pivot bike can do is by looking at downhill bikes. Now, Norco have the Aurum, but the Commencal is probably the one that has the best tail behind it, because Henri Perrion absolutely destroyed the field by riding one. His performance on the roughest, fastest and the most ridiculously tech sections really made some other bikes look like they were stalling in places. Now that is a race bike, and it has a high pivot, meaning the main pivot is quite high up above that chain line, and if you look closely on a bike like this, you'll see it has an idler wheel, very similar to the guide wheels and the jockey wheels you have on the Derailleur, and they route that on the pivot point or above the pivot point and have the chain from the chainring routing over that. Now, what is it about a high pivot bike that's so good, and why exactly would you want one? And actually, what's bad about them? Let's talk about all these things. Okay, so we'll start by looking at a low pivot bike first, which is the best compromise of a bike, suspension bike, which is why they're the most popular. They have the best combination of things on there. So they're going to brake well, i.e. they're going to perform well under braking, which means they're not too susceptible to the phenomenon known as anti-rise, which deals with brake squat and brake jack. They're the sort of two individual things. And then of course they can be tuned depending on the suspension orientation to handle anti-squat. So if a bike has little anti-squat, it's going to be bobbing around as you're compressing that suspension, and if it has a lot, it's going to extend almost. So the ideal is to have something around 100% mark, which means the forces are going to counter themselves and it'll feel nice and level. Now, of course, by having a low pivot down here, this is a compromise, because it allows for all of these things, and it allows the bike to pedal well, and it means there's not excessive chain growth. Okay, so chain growth, the chain doesn't actually grow, but what happens is the chain stay effectively lengthens as the wheel sort of arcs through the travel. Okay, now how much it actually arcs depends on the suspension design, and the effect is you get pedal kickback, which is a horrible feeling, and it basically helps, well, this stops and chokes that rear suspension. I think choking is the best way to think about it. So we know that low pivot bikes generally are probably the best all-rounders out there, which is why virtually every brand out there make them. But high pivot bikes offer something that low pivot bikes don't. They go faster through rough stuff, and they achieve this by having an axle path basically that moves much further rearward. So the Trek we're going to talk about moves 25 millimeters backwards when it hits something. So you imagine riding into a fast rock and that wheel can go backwards to get around it. It's not going to stall or hook up or hang up or whatever term you want to use quite as much as a bike that's got a more vertical axle path, and you can achieve this by having a high pivot point. So that's great, but by having a high pivot point, you're going to have a huge amount of anti-squat, which means when you pedal the bike, you're nearly going to extend the suspension, which also means you're going to get horrific pedal kickback due to the amount that chain grows on the bike. Now, designers get around this by putting an idler wheel, which is similar to a guide wheel that you'd see on the rear derailleur or rear derailleur of the bike, whichever way you're looking at the image, and by putting it on the pivot point or above it. So you're routing the chain above that pivot point, enabling the sort of the pedaling action to feel more in line with a low pivot bike, but it has the suspension action of the high pivot bike. That's all great, isn't it? So why don't all bikes have this? Well, there are a few characteristics to these bikes that aren't necessarily desirable. Now, the first one is it's more maintenance, really, because you've got another wheel, another set of bearings, and a pivot point essentially to maintain, and they can be quite complicated the way that they work. So that might put people off. You're having more chain on the bike, which is slightly heavier, although not in all cases. So the Forbidden Druid, as far as I know, is about 3 links longer than a full standard length chain. Normally you lop off about 6 links off a chain when you're fitting one to a bike. Yeah, of course that varies with the length of chain stay, so you're not talking about that much more chain there, so I don't think the weight is much of an issue. Of course there is the hardware to go with that though. Friction apparently is something. Now, I've not ridden the trail version, so this is where you would really notice the difference. Now, on a downhill bike, it's going to be negligible. The forward momentum you're going to gain by having a suspension design like this means it's really not worth worrying about. But bike has got a pedal all day long. Any additional friction, people don't really want. The whole point is to reduce your friction so your forward momentum is faster. So that could be a downside to them. And then, of course, the amount of rearward axle path basically that it has on the bike. Yeah, it's amazing when you're hitting stuff, but there is a bit of a downside to this. Depending on how much it grows, your chainstay is effectively getting longer. So think about this. You're going through a really rough bit of trail and you hit one of those sort of bold turns, your bike G's out in the turn and you've used nearly all the travel, yeah? You know that feeling where you want to almost manual out of the turn, or you want to pick up the front end and get on the pedals? Well, on a bike like this, where the chainstay grows even more, the front end's going to be even more weighted, so it's going to feel really difficult to do this. So your dynamic geometry is basically changing. So for that reason, a lot of bike designers do choose to not have high pivot bikes, so they can maintain sort of the length of the bike, the dynamic geometry as it's changing whilst the bike is being used effectively. But still, you can't deny a high pivot bike with an idler wheel makes a fantastic race machine. Now, what I want to know, do you think high pivot bikes could be the future? Because there are more and more coming out in the market, each with their own slight design tweaks. The Trek we're going to talk about in a minute has got its own set of system on there. Of course, there's Forbidden bikes, and the eagle-eyed amongst you might have spotted there's a Cannondale, or what appears to be a Cannondale coming anyway. Certainly from what we've seen in the 50-1 videos, there looked like there was a miniature version of that downhill bike prototype that they had. So that is super interesting. I can't wait to see that if that's the case, because I'm really interested in high pivot bikes because of the ones I've ridden in the past. Like Trek, way back in the day, had the Session 10, I think it was called, about 2006. Had a really steep head angle, which wasn't good, but it was phenomenal through the rough stuff. And if a bike can feel phenomenal through rough stuff, it's got to be good, right? So what do you reckon? High pivot bikes, yay or nay? Would you have one? Or do you think they're just for the racers and they should stay in that sort of race realm? Let us know what you think. And have you got one actually? Anyone out there got a high pivot bike? Well, let us know in those comments. Could they take over? Time will tell. Okay, so let's jump into news then and look at the Trek Session. So this is the brand new 2021 Trek Session, although you could argue is basically a 2022 one given where the market is right now. So let's just call it the 2022 Trek Session. So as we know well, Reece Wilson won the World Championships on the last orientation is, which had a regular lower pivot point on there. And he was also running a mullet style setup, so the smaller back wheel and the 29 front wheel. So this brand new Trek Session downhill bike, as well as having a high pivot and an idler wheel on there, it has the capability to be run in 27.5 mullet style with a 29 front wheel, or 29 front and rear, which is how it comes as stock. So if you want to run it with a 27.5 inch rear, you flip the Mino chip, which can also give you head angle adjustment from 63 to 63.5 degrees. And there's also a cup that can go in the front end, basically under the head tube there, a little bit like the Gorilla Gravity bikes, the way that they sort of have the modular frame system. So really cool concept, meaning you've got one race frame here, technically because it's a downhill bike, and you can run 3 different ways from it. Also, something quite cool is the Mino chip on the bike can adjust the progressivity of that rear shock on there, so you can have it feeling a bit more linear or ramping up that bit more for those real rough courses. So interesting stuff. So a few shots of the bike on screen. Now the first thing you might notice about it, other than the fact it's got that high pivot, is looks different to before, isn't it? Yeah, it's because it's made of aluminium. They're not making it in carbon fibre, so that's really quite interesting. We're seeing this from a few manufacturers. Now, of course, some manufacturers will naturally use carbon fibre to get the shape of a bike that they require for pivot points or whatever in a lighter, stiffer way that you can achieve by using alloy. But alloy, arguably, is a better material in many cases to build a bike from, and Trek certainly thinks so in this case. So there's 3 sizes, all based on length. So you get 440, 465 and 495mm reach on the sizes, and they've got size specific chainstays. Okay, so on those three sizes, you've got 439, 445 and 452mm chainstays. But here's the cool thing. The chainstay is actually the same chainstay. It doesn't get any bigger. It's just mounted in a slightly different position to give you a longer rear end that's proportional for the front end of the bike. That's really cool stuff, meaning they're not making additional parts they don't need to. Very cool stuff in Trek, that. So interestingly, the rear wheel movement on this bike, as we discussed high pivots a minute ago in the topic, 25mm. 25mm, that's like an inch. That is a lot of rear axle movement on the bike. I reckon that thing would feel phenomenal riding into stuff at speed. I'd love to have a go on a bike that could handle rough stuff like that. I think Trek have really nailed it with this bike. So we've got a few different builds out there. I think the one on screen a second ago was $5,000 as it was. In which case it's a bit of a bargain. If that's the case with the price for a full race bike spec, I think that's pretty cool stuff. Now, I've always liked Trek bikes. They err on the more cautious side of cool. They're fairly conservative, I guess you could say. But I think that's great because there's no denying it looks like an amazing race bike, and we're sure to see some amazing results on it this year. Okay, next up in news, I just want to talk a little bit about Tram Access, in particular the GX offerings that I've got on my Canyon Spectral at the moment. So there's a few shots whizzing past on screen. I've actually changed the rocker paddle on the touch point paddle on the lever there because I just wasn't getting on with just how different the actual shifting system is compared to good old-fashioned cables. There's too many different things about it because it's so instant, the shifting on there. If you're resting your thumb on it, I found I was accidentally changing gear. So I've tried flipping the way that the gears work around using the app there, but I just couldn't get it quite right for what I wanted. So now I've got this version on. Now this just feels so much more natural to me. The position your thumb sits on, the fact that you can use your forefinger and your thumb. And you might also notice I've not got it mounted directly with the matchmaker system on there. I've actually got it mounted with an individual clamp, so I've got it much nearer to the grip, so I'm not moving my hand at all, which is one of the things I wasn't so keen on with the other setup. It's really cool, and if you're into this sort of setup, the paddle itself is €20. I think it's €20, isn't it? Saying that, making that up, yeah, €20. So yeah, okay, so it's another hop-up thing, another thing to spend money on, but it's great that there's two completely different options. Let's face it, it's a completely different way of shifting gears on a bike. Physique aren't necessarily a name that occurs to me when I talk about downhill shoes or aggressive shoes, but we did see some riding shoes from them probably a couple of years back now. I did a video with Neil, and they're making some really cool stuff. Check this out, they're doing like proper flat pedal and downhill style clip-in shoes now. So this one is the Gravita Tensor. It's a downhill flat pedal shoe. They do it in clip as well, but I thought the flat pedal shoe was worth a look. They actually sent this in, it just happened to be my size. I've actually tried them out a couple of times. As you know, I'm not really that much of a flat pedal rider these days, but they're not bad. So they've got the Vibram Mega Grip sole on them, so it's not quite as grippy as a 510, but I think this is the closest that I've felt. You can actually feel the pedal, which is really good on here. I think something that a lot of shoe companies get wrong is by having so much protection and damping in the sole that you can't feel the pedal. And although there'll be loads of grip when you're stood up on the shoe, when you're pedaling itself, you can find your feet move around a bit on the pedals. I've had that with various shoes I've tried over the last few years, but these seem to be really quite good actually. So the uppers on them are really quite different. As you notice, they've got a really slim profile, which looks a bit odd to start with. When you put your foot into them, it kind of makes sense. They've got a high inside heel there, they've got archway support, they've got power strap, and they've got offset laces, so it looks a bit more like I guess like a climbing shoe. Cool stuff. Pretty wildly different from a lot of things out on the market. I think they're kind of cool. I did feel a bit naked in them compared to, you know, how protective some of my other shoes felt, but really they've got all the protection you need. Like the toe box on these is quite insane, and there's loads of support, so it's definitely another candidate out there if you like your flat pedals and you want something that's going to compete with what 510 have really made famous on the market from the original Impact shoes. Yeah, great stuff. Another solid option. But like I said, they come in a clip-in version, and really that would be my bread and butter. But cool stuff from Physique. Really good to see someone making some really decent, well thought out shoes for mountain biking. Great stuff. What do they cost? Already forgotten. €164.99 in the UK, so probably about €190 or something like that. I'd have thought about $200 US. expensive shoes nonetheless, but they've definitely got that premium feel about them. So if you're in a market for a pair of shoes, definitely worth checking them out. And also, don't forget, Crank Brothers also brought out a range of shoes fairly recently. And of course there's Ride Concepts, who we're going to talk about next, because they have their new TNT shoe, which leads me on to a bit of a link. So the TNT I've also ridden in, that's got their DST 4.0, their super grippy rubber compound sole on that. And the sole is a bit thicker than the sole is on the Physique shoe. You can't feel the pedal as well, but the rubber is slightly grippier, so you kind of got different feel in there. It's a super protective shoe, and this is the latest version of it, which at a glance actually doesn't look that much different, but they have revised some things on there. Now, interestingly, on the forefoot and the heel on them, the actual sole is actually got deeper and a more detailed edging on the grip, the traction on there, so better off the bike for walking or building in Dan Atherton's case. Seems to be his signature shoe. In fact, here's some shots of Dan with his shoes on, and we know that Dan's ridden flat pedals for a long time, and with a textbook riding style, well, it's kind of they're going to be pretty good if Dan's riding them. So they've got the microfiber synthetic upper on them, which is also antibacterial, which hopefully means they're not going to pong. The last ones I had, they didn't pong, so I guess that's pretty good. They've also got the big power strap on them. They've got a D30 in the insole on them, which is great because of the fact that there's a bit of flex on the sole for feeling the pedal, but you're not going to get any sort of vibration transferred through to you. The D30 is what they're using in their shoes. I think it was great. Okay, so let's dive into comments then. So I wasn't here for part of last week's show. I pre-recorded some. Actually had a week off and basically just rode bikes quite a lot, which was nice. Shock horror, I actually rode an e-bike nearly for an entire week. Just really wanted to try and get my head around e-bike stuff. You know, I've ridden them here and there, but not enough time dedicated, so I basically tried to avoid riding a normal mountain bike. And you know, by the end of the week, actually, I really started liking the bike. But I want to pick this up another time because there's some interesting stuff coming from the back of this. So, into comments then. So first up is from Kevin Niemeyer, who says, I feel like if 27 were to go extinct, it's only because manufacturers are driving it to an extinction, not because of lack of interest. To a degree, I think you're right. But arguably, 27.5 is a better size than 26 because of the fact it suits both smaller and taller riders. 26 was, speaking from a taller rider point of view, horrendous. It was just, you know, just like for a smaller rider, 29 might be. Arguably, 27.5 would be the best compromise. As for the manufacturers pushing that way, well, 26 is always going to be around. It's pretty much what you see on kids' bikes. And you know, you see some people running 27.5 front mullet with a 26 on the rear for like fest sort of riding, where they want something stronger. But yeah, there's no denying that the manufacturers will be pushing stuff on, but they're not just doing it to make a buck from it. They're doing it to try and progress the performance of the bikes. And I think actually the mid-size wheel, even though it's not my preference, probably is the best all-rounder. Next up from Eric Johnson. I think most people I know have gone back to 26. Anything bigger starts to zap the fun. Hey, there's no doubt that riding a smaller size wheel can be more fun. Can also be more terrifying, but that might be your idea of fun. Interesting comment. Next up from Underbiked and Overconfident. Great handle. 26-inch equals kids bikes. If you don't believe me, check out the recommendations for anyone over 10 years or anyone over 135 centimetres. Looking for my daughter's new bike, I found GTs, Cross, Scott, Hardtails, etc. for kids, 1x7, all with 26-inch wheels. Well, there you go. Proves the point there. So yeah, having nice big wheels, and I guess by now, so kids' bikes would have had much heavier wheels in the past. But all these kids' bikes having 26-inch wheels, you've got like decades of development in them. So even at a budget price point, you're probably going to have pretty good wheels and tyres available. So I'm all for that. You know, I'm going to have to be buying kids' bikes soon for Dustin. So, well, I hope so anyway. You might hate bikes. Who knows? But I think it's nothing but a great thing for kids and anyone that needs 26-inch wheels. John Phillips. Still rocking my 2009 Santa Cruz V10 on 26-inch wheels. But looking to put a 27.5-inch lower on my Fox 40s. Oh, nice to sort of mullet that up. That'd be pretty cool. Send us some pictures if you get that done. Be a nice little upgrade, that. Greenbox. Future is EMTB with mullet 29 front, 27.5 rear. I've never had this much fun on two wheels. Hey, that's I've been riding Spectral on, by the way, keeping with the Canyon theme there. Yeah, and that's got 29 front, 27.5 rear. And other than the fact that I've got to say, I really don't like the look of mullet bikes. does feel really good. Definitely suits the bike because you've got a really big, not like burly back tyre on there, and I kind of get it from the motorbike style thing. And also the fact that it's a big heavy bike. All e-bikes are. Having a smaller wheel on the back definitely helps with some agility on there. Would I want it on a normal bike? Absolutely not. On the e-bike, I think you're right. Yeah. Joe, 27.5. I've still got a big presence on my local trails. Nearly all the local diggers and 50 to wannabes. Oh, I'm using that 50 to wannabe. That's awesome. Yeah, no, for sure. But I think at the end of the day, it's choices. Choices are great. No one is making you buy anything. Okay, so yes, maybe in 10 years time you're going to start struggling to get some components and parts in 26-inch, and yes, you will find already there are problems getting certain suspension forks in that because of the fact it's 27.5, but thankfully you can get away with running the 27.5. You know, there's not too much difference there. Yes, the offset can be a bit different, but it's not the end of the world. It's not as bad as some people paint it out to be as well, so you can get those things. You know, I think the bigger picture actually is how difficult it must be for bike shops. Imagine owning a bike shop and you only had to deal with 26-inch wheels and then 700cc for road, and then mountain biker came out with 29. Then it came out with 27.5. So you got to stock 3 sets of sized wheels, tyres, inner tubes, forks. Nightmare. In fact, if you're a bike shop, has this been a nightmare for you over the years, or is it just simplified things? You know, maybe you've just kept 26-inch to budget and 27.5 to high end. I don't know, like just throwing it out there. Interested to know. Let us know what you think in those comments. Okay, now it's time for Rewind. Now, usually this is a bit where I talk about all old school stuff that you've sent us, and we have got some great ones parked for next week's show. But seeing as Ibis Bikes have just celebrated being 40 years old, I thought we'd have a little Ibis Bike special. Now, I know Scott Nicol quite well. His nickname is Chuck, and he actually started Ibis Bikes on April the 1st, which I think is great, in 1981. He decided on that day, yeah, whatever I'm doing, I'm sacking it in. I'm going to make bikes now. And basically, the route he got there is fascinating. So he was a hippie way back in the day in North California. And he went on a road trip essentially to cut the chase here. And on that road trip, in the back of his van at the time, was none other than Charlie Cunningham and also Joe Breeze, who he made really good friends with. Of course, both of those were making frames from the very beginning of mountain biking. Of course, Scott was there for the ride as well. And they all got on like a house on fire. And as a result of this, Scott ended up doing a bit of an apprenticeship with them, learning how to build frames. And off the back of that, he launched Ibis Bikes. Now, Ibis Bikes, the name is quite an interesting one because Scott had always liked birds, and there's a lot of cool bike names associated with birds. There's Avocet, there's Merlin, Falcon, what else have I written down? There's loads of options out there, Kestrel, and he was looking for a name that was a bit more elegant and something that suited what he wanted to do. And he came to Ibis Bikes, which quite a cool name, and Ibis, when it's in flight, looks like a nice elegant bird. Some Australian viewers out there might have referred to it by bin chicken in the past, which did crack me up because I didn't know anything about this. I asked Scott at Ibis about it and he was like, yeah, that one stuck with us. But hey, it's a nice name for a bike company and they make great bikes. So let's have a look at some of their classic bikes from over the years. The first one is their Trials comp I want to talk about. So this dates back to 85, 86. So this is a 20-inch wheel observed Trials bike. Now, I'd still quite like one of these for playing around on because the skills you can learn on a Trials bike is insane. Now, they made 2 models, one with 20-inch front and rear and one with a 24-inch front wheel, which Scott tended to ride quite a lot. I think you could get over stuff a bit easier on them, and they're a little bit more forgiving than the tiny 20-inch ones, which I guess probably just weren't as much fun because they were, you know, a proper serious competition bike. In case you're not aware, Observed Trials is a style of mountain biking or a style of cycling. We have to negotiate a course of obstacles and you're given points every time you make a mistake. So the points are called dabs. So a point could be awarded to you for putting your foot down, and that might be, say, 2 dabs. If you crash or go out of the course, it might be 5 dabs, whatever it is. And the object is to complete each section in the least amount of points, basically, so the least points wins. and it became observed trials because you're observed as you're doing this from all the different sides. Really cool thing actually to learn bike skills actually. So next up, they made a carbon bike, well, carbon tubes lugged into a steel frame in 1988. So this is it. For 1988 they were doing carbon from the beginning. Pretty cool. By 1995 they had the Sasbo, which was their high pivot bike with the pivot that's called the Sweet Spot, and that was designed by John Castellano. I hope I got the name right. And basically he came up with the compromise of he wanted to ride a bike that pedalled like a hardtail but had the comfort of a full sus. And by having a pivot halfway up the bike, when you stood up and pedalled, it felt like a hardtail, and when you sat down, it was nice and comfortable. Following on from that, I think the following year actually, maybe the year after, maybe 96, 97, there was the bow tie. This was a full titanium version with no pivot point. It relied on the flex of the titanium. Here it is on screen. And even though it's a bit of a wacky bike, I think it's absolutely stunning, and I think it was a real bold move to bring that bike out. Next up came the silk tie. So another approach on using titanium, the natural flex that titanium has in it for suspension purposes, in a bit more of a regular configuration. So this is one, a bit of a dusty one on screen right now, and I think there's one on their website, and hopefully there should be some screen flow right now. All of this stuff, by the way, is in a really interesting history piece on their site. I think their particular website is amazing for this. They've got 40 stories documenting, I think it's 40 stories documenting the 25 years or whatever it is, or is it 25 stories documenting the 40 years? I forget. I'll put a link to it in the description underneath, and you can go through and have a read yourself. It's really, really cool stuff, and they're being fully candid about the brand, just telling you all the stuff that they did over the years. Great stuff. Okay, so in 2005, the last bike I want to talk about is when they launched the Mojo. So this was 140mm travel, DW linkage, carbon monocoque trail riding frame, and when it came out it really didn't look like anything else on the market. It had almost no branding on there, and it came in some really lurid colours. I think there's like a lime green, a bright orange, almost like an Eddie Merckx orange, and there was a blue, I'm going to say like a baby blue or a powder blue type colour, or it might be neon, I forget. But the point is, it didn't really look like much else out there, and people were kind of a bit puzzled by it. You know, what is this bike? Is it for us? You know, who's it for? It can't be strong enough. It's made of carbon. So they signed up Brian Lopes, and Brian Lopes developed with them the Lopes link. So it was a stiffened upper link. Instead of having a linkage on both sides, it joined basically a big bit of structure basically to the frame. And he started winning things like the A-Line race at Crankworx on this bike when other people were using downhill bikes. So straight away people sort of paid attention, and well, the rest is history, and then they just went onwards making more and more great bikes. They're one of my favourite brands, and I mean, I don't have an Ibis. I've had an Ibis Mojo in the past. I've had a Mojo HDR, and I'd have one again. But I really quite like one of the older bikes, just for the collection. And actually, just a real random fact, I've got my laptop here just with a script on screen here just for me to refer to it as I need to, and balancing it is an old Ibis bottle opener that Chuck gave me many moons ago. So I'm actually going to use this to open a beer and have a toast to Ibis at the end of this show. So pretty cool stuff. Okay, so that's the end of this week's show. There was actually something else that I was going to record, but I've gone on for a bit too long. So on next week's show, we're going to have a little look at Rollingdale Cycles. Look them up on Instagram. In fact, there's a link right there to Rollingdale Cycles on Instagram. And we're going to be talking a bit about Dale and what he does on next week's show. Hopefully you enjoyed this week's show. Let us know what you think in the comments, and we'll see you soon. See you later.